Hello and welcome to another episode of But Have You Heard About? I'm your host, Courtney, and today I'm joined by my super awesome brother-in-law, Tyler.
Hi, I'm Tyler.
I love the enthusiasm because you know what? Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite things. It's beer. Because beer is probably up there like the greatest thing next to margaritas where you can't taste the tequila and you just keep drinking them until, you've tried every flavor at the bar and you didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, I one of my favorite things about beer, now that it's summertime, is to cut the grass and then have a beer. That's like the best. It's actually the best time. Beer tastes best then. That's what I'm trying to say.
It's like a reward. The best
Yes.
beer is the reward of mowing the grass.
Correct.
Yeah. So I just want to give like a quick backstory kind of on beer. I feel all fancy and smart because I went to like 2 classes talking about beer. We went over like a little bit of history and I was like, I'm so much smarter than everybody else here.
Yep.
So,
I've done that to you, Courtney. Do you remember that?
oh yeah, this is why you're on this one. So I can be like to you now.
Perfect.
It's a perfect combo.
Happy to be here.
So beer has been around longer than society, and not just beer, but also wine. Anything that has that alcohol that needs that fermentation, especially with yeast. Even though we had no idea what yeast was, we were constantly making beer as a human race. Basically, people had no idea until much later on what yeast was and what that whole process. They didn't realize that yeast was there as a living organism. You can just make beer with those 3 ingredients, and you can make it taste like bananas. You can make it taste like apples. All depending on the type of grain you're putting in, how long you let it sit, if you're making an ale, a lager, yada, yada, all this cool stuff that I thought that anytime you wanted, I don't know, a beer to taste like an apple, you had to put an apple in it. I was wrong. You don't.
And it's confusing because, nowadays you go into, your beer mart or what have you, right? And there are apple beers and there are apple ciders, or there's blueberry flavored beers, right? And so a lot of them do have, nowadays will brew with fruit and or fruit flavoring. I also didn't know for the longest time that some beers, get those notes, if you will, from the same type of ingredients. Like, again, you go and you see IPAs, for example, right? How could there be so many IPAs when it's just you're using the same ingredients? Well, it's not really the same ingredients. They're because we're novices, right? And that's
yeah. And you can have those different barley, because barley is kind of like any grain feature that you're using. Basically, there are different strains of it, just like there's different strains of yeast or whatever. And, however you feed the yeast is how it's going to grow. So all yeast wants to do is reproduce and have sugar, which sounds like a weekend plan for like most people in America anyways. Like, I just want sugar and I want to reproduce.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yep.
So we're all secretly yeast. Again, like yeast is that living organism, had no idea that's what actually was making the alcohol. And so for the longest time, religions used alcohol, whether it was wine or beer, as kind of like this thank the gods type of moment. And so if you look throughout history, and especially, those older religions like Egyptian, or even thinking about like the cult of Dionysus, there's a lot of this thank God and thank the gods for alcohol.
That makes, I guess, without having ever thought of the fact that there was a mystery to brewing, right? There was a mystery to brewing. Without knowing that there was this microscopic organism in there, this stuff would just appear, that you'd put, milk or wine or whatever out and then later come back and it would be alcoholic. Yeah, of course, you need a way to explain that. God's a great way to account for that without an understanding of microbiology, right?
Yeah. So thinking about that, it makes so much sense to me that Egyptians, when they buried their dead, especially when they would make these offerings to the gods during rituals and festival, they would put beer and wine with the mummified dead to be like how you're going to pay the gods going forth. And also, I didn't think about it back, before we had filtration systems, before we had that purification of water, everybody would get dysentery from drinking water from the river, right? The only way you could really purify it was make it into alcohol. And like, that whole joke of you're going to drink vodka when you're in Russia because that's their version of water. Or even like, don't drink the water in Mexico because it's not as purified, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
But you have this when people are making alcohol to travel with, especially like beer or wine, that percentage, the ABV percentage, is significantly lower than what we're used to now. So you may have this like minimal buzz on 2% beer your whole day. So you're never going to get dehydrated, and you're never going to feel, you're never going to be too drunk, as you would be like now if you drink, 8% beer all day and didn't have any water to go with it. So you wouldn't die. So of course you're like, this is the gift of the gods. Water is horrible. It causes you to have dysentery and you're going to die.
Yeah. Well, yes. Okay. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. If I go down to the river, I'm thirsty, right? I'm thirsty. I go down to the river. Well, I'm not going down to the river because I saw someone else go down to the river and they either puked their guts out or whatever. And again, depending on where else you were, salt water is not good to drink either, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't even have like the pasteurization from Louis Pasteur until the 1850s. And between him and another French guy, they had the whole idea of yeast. So we're talking like the 1800s. But
Right.
way before then, obviously, we had a society.
Right.
So what you doing? You making beer and wine to take on like little adventures with you, so you didn't have to drink the water.
That's a thing that was done. The British Navy would do that and overhop their beer, IPA, India Pale Ale, overhop their ale so that it could keep when they brewed it and shipped it from, and have to go down and around and get it to India. Overhop as and again, I wish I knew, but I don't. It's something something to do with the hops, like would keep it from turning.
Yeah, because the minute you have any sort of liquid come in, so whether it's like humidity and the fact that you're shipping it, you're going to have added stuff into it. It's not the barrel itself that's giving the flavor. It's the organisms inside, whether it's, those three main ingredients or the yeast that's giving that flavor. So when you overhop it, that makes total sense to me.
Well, and pointing out that you're not getting flavor from the barrel, right? Where something like a wine that's part of the process. Not that there aren't beers that aren't aged in barrels, but that's not what we're talking about here today.
Yeah. Like the barrels have no purpose. So if it tastes like wood, it's not because it was in a barrel. I can promise you that. But wine does taste different based on how it's stored and whatnot. Religion and alcohol, to me, it makes me laugh because you have like it's throughout the whole spectrum when it comes to religion and alcohol. You have some places that are very like, you can't have alcohol, period, not even in ceremonies and rituals. But then if you look throughout time, like I mentioned Dionysus, literally wine was used all the time to celebrate Dionysus. Be like, hell yeah, we're all going to get drunk during these rituals. Even in Christianity, the blood of Christ is wine. So you're already, chilling with alcohol. And when it comes to like the Norse religion, you want to have those ales and meads for seasonal religious activities.
Seasonal religious activities. All those.
I'm not a Norse god mythology major.
All those good old pagan. All those pagan rituals. I don't think it's barely beer related, but I want to tell you it anyways, Courtney, because I think it's funny. And almost all Norse mythology stories are like this. I read Neil Gaiman has a book. I think it's just called Norse Mythology. It's his version. Like he read the original stories versus translating them, and then like it's his interpretation of them, right? And a lot of the stories in there are just Thor because that's the only ones that made it through, from the Germanic tribes that downward through time. This is one of the only stories I can remember from the book, and it was this: Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, is missing, and so he goes to ask Loki because, of course, that's probably who knows what happened to it. He doesn't know, but he has to go find it. Otherwise, Thor's going to like rip his head off or something because, all those, or smash his head in or something, because they all ended with violence with Thor. And then Loki finds that a troll has it, or a giant. I don't remember because the translation was always confusing. They have the word for troll sometimes, and dwarf and giant are like all the same thing. So at least that was my understanding of it, or not understanding of it, probably. But anyways, this troll has Mjolnir and will give it back to Thor if he can marry Lady Freya. Yeah, Lady Freya. And Loki agrees to it. goes back to tell Thor. Of course, they're all upset with him because they're like, dude, you can't, she's not going to marry this troll. So then Thor dresses up like a woman. Thor dresses up like a woman, pretends to be Lady Freya. Loki transforms into a woman and then is like, the bride, like, right, like the bridesmaid or whatever, like, oh, so, Thor's beard is under a veil, like, and the troll's like, let me see that beautiful face. And Loki's like, oh, not until the wedding night, basically. But then Thor, over the course of the evening, eats like all the food, like 8 steers and, and then he drinks like 8 casks of ale, and and it's like, wow, Lady Freya can put away her ale. And then of course Loki has some but now I'm realizing this story wasn't as fun. um but maybe someone thought it was fun. I thought it was funny.
It's a funny story because somehow Thor is drinking ale, or he's drinking his little ale under his veil that has never been lifted during the wedding ceremony. And I think that's a game changer. Like, how can you? It's like keeping your mask on now when you're in public and somehow still drinking,
Sure,
so no one sees.
sure. For me, what I liked about it was just because I'm picturing now like Chris Hemsworth, right?
Yeah,
Dressed as a woman, being like tee hee 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 hee, like trying to pretend, like just wait until like after the wedding feast to like eat all the food. The story ends by getting Mjolnir and then Thor kills everyone.
it's a very Norse god. Like, basically, don't steal a hammer that's not yours,
Get your head
or
smashed.
yeah, or try to make someone marry you that doesn't even know you, or you're gonna get
the,
murdered
all
with a
of those
hammer.
stories are really violent, but I think it's because of all the beer that they I don't know. I was trying to bring it back to the topic at hand, Courtney, after my big
No,
Norse segue. And
no, I like it. I'm totally going to keep going on the religion and beer because I kind of want to bring it to monks. Because when you think of monks, you don't necessarily think of people that brew things.
No.
You don't think of brewers.
No.
You don't really think of alcoholics in any sense. However, like when they would create these, I'm going to call it a monastery, but I feel like my Catholic side is going to yell at me. It's not like,
No, they're monasteries.
yeah, it's a monastery. Okay, so I got that right. Oh my gosh, I'm so proud of myself. I watched Les Mis enough times to remember those words. So they have these monasteries and they're growing their own crops, and they also need to drink beer or wine. Otherwise, they're going to get the dysentery from the water because they don't know better. And so when they would overmake it, their whole gambit of, nonprofitness and giving back to the community basically meant that if you were a traveler, you wanted to stop at a monastery because the monks there were brewing, and they would have to give you extra if they had any, which I thought was really cool. So back in the medieval Renaissance time, you were traveling because what the hell else are you going to do except for die by the age of 22? So you're traveling so maybe you can live to 31. And during your travels, you're going to stop at monasteries. Like once you realize that that's the whole thing, because you're not going to.
Well, also, where else is there to stop?
Yeah, like a whole town is planned around religion,
Sure.
Especially during that period. So monks are over here making their brew, and they see the foam head on top, right? And that's like the yeast, I'm thinking, if I remember correctly. So when they're finishing up with the beer, they'd be like, oh, we got to put this into the next batch so it'll just continue because God is good. And so instead of calling it yeast, they called it like a God is good type of metaphor. And they would take it, put it in the next batch. So there are still monks who actually brew beer and sell it for church-related things. Have you ever had a Trappist beer? Do you know about Trappist beers?
I've heard of Trappist beers because, again, once upon a time in a previous life, I like to think I was a beer snob, right?
Yeah.
And then, and then you get lazy, and then you forget things. So, well, I mean, I did.
Yeah,
I did.
Well, so there's these Trappist breweries. There's only 13 in the whole wide world. 5 are in Belgium. Obviously,
Sure.
Think of Belgium,
Sure.
I would think of beer, so that makes sense to me. 2 in the Netherlands. There's 1 in Austria, 1 in Italy, 1 in England, 1 in France, 1 in Spain, and weirdly, there's 1 in the US.
And so what are these monks selling beer?
So it has to be brewed by a monk. So the brewers themselves have to be an acting, living monk.
It's now, presumably, these are like Christian monks, or are
I'm
these
guessing.
Buddhist monks?
You know what? It has to be a Christian. Yes, because they're part of a special order. I totally looked it up. It was in Latin. And then I tried to, I went down a rabbit hole because I was like, oh my gosh, it's Latin. I took Latin in high school and college. I can decipher this. And then I went down a rabbit hole
Mm.
and life just kind of failed me. But, anyways, just know
That's fine.
if it's in Latin, it must obviously be Christian. Let's just be
Yep.
real.
Yep. Well, because again, if it was a Buddhist monk, it wouldn't it wouldn't have been in Latin. It would have been in Sanskrit or something.
Exactly.
So, perfect.
So for these breweries to be considered Trappist, it has to be getting brewed by those monks, and they have like a whole like a whole label. And you can't buy the US one in Texas. That I do know. They don't sell it here. And I believe I know it's on the Northeast coast.
So I maybe could find out. Do you know what it's called?
No.
Well, I'll hear Trappist Monks, Massachusetts, St. Joseph's Abbey.
Yes. It's in Massachusetts.
It is in Massachusetts.
And it opened in 2013. The oldest one is in Belgium and opened in 1826. No, I'm sorry. The oldest one is in France and it was opened in 1826. But I don't think that one's currently producing anything. So the one that's currently producing is in Belgium. But yeah, so you can buy them if you want. It's fun to know that a monk brewed your beer.
I just like the idea, because again, whenever you think of a monk, or at least whenever I think of a monk, I think of like Friar Tuck from, the
Robin Hood.
From Robin Hood. So like with the hair, with the hair.
But wait, which Robin Hood is it? Is it the comedy Robin Hood or is it the cartoon?
The Disney cartoon with the fox. I mean,
yeah, of course, it has to be.
Right, not Kevin Costner, but yeah. Whenever I think Robin Hood, I think cartoon fox.
I feel like that's the only way I actually knew the story well enough. And then anytime I've taken a history class that kind of goes over what actually happened, I'm always like, no, Disney would never lie to me in a cartoon with animals.
So Courtney, I distinctly recall, like in 11th grade in high school, a history teacher, his name's Mr. King. Basically, I didn't know Robin Hood wasn't a real dude. And I was pretty sure that like King Arthur wasn't a real dude, but I also didn't know enough about the King Arthur story, where now I know that if I knew anything about the King Arthur story, I never would have been confused if he was a real dude, because like the Green Knight and Merlin and all the shit, but all I had heard was all I'd seen of King Arthur was the Holy Grail, Monty Python. So again, I was just helplessly stupid. And so I basically asked Mr. King, the history teacher, if Robin Hood, and he's like, I bet you think King Arthur's real. And I just remember being like, no, even though I had no idea.
It's the day you realize that you have been taught something wrong and you're like, nobody told me it was wrong. I didn't know.
Right. Like it's funny now, but I felt kind of dumb. But at the same time, I also knew that I had no idea how I could have known different. Like I had that experience, but anyways.
Yeah. But I don't until you know. And that also brings me to my next point, which is that there is a beer purity law. Have you ever heard of a beer purity law?
The only place that I know that has a beer purity law is Germany has a beer purity law, right?
Yes. I'm not going to pronounce it. Actually, no. I'm going to try.
Okay.
I am German. Like I did that 23andMe, so I know I have German in me. Maybe it'll just come out, okay? I'm looking at the word, okay. Reinheitsgebot. It just means purity order. Reinheitsgebot?
Doesn't sound wrong, but again, I don't know what would sound right.
But this whole purity of beer, basically it's a series of regulations that limited the ingredients of beer in Germany and the states of the former Holy Roman Empire. The best known version of the law was adopted in Bavaria in 1516, but there are similar regulations that predate that Bavarian order. However, the modern regulations also significantly differ from the 1516 Bavaria version because, as I've already mentioned, we didn't know about yeast, and obviously you can't have beer without yeast.
So is the augmentation just the addition of once we understood what yeast was, the law had to be amended.
Yes and no. Like they made changes throughout. I mean, this law was 1516. That's
Hmm.
500 years ago. And one of the main reasons it was introduced was to prevent price competition with bakers for wheat and rye. So the restrictions of grains to barley was meant to ensure the availability of
Oh,
affordable bread,
interesting.
as wheat and rye were reserved for use by bakers. The rule may have also had a protectionist role in the economic sense. I'm not really good with economics, so don't ask me too much about that
Right.
part.
We're gonna take the source's word for it on this.
Yeah, I'll take it. But beers from northern Germany often contained additives that were not present in those Bavarian beers. So, just a reminder, Germany is actually younger than the United States when you think of like Germany as
Hmm.
a whole. Even pre East and West Germany, Germany didn't really come about until like the 1800s. So it's 100 years younger.
And when did you say the purity law were first introduced in Germany?
1516 in Bavaria.
Okay.
So we can say that Bavaria has basically had that purity law, and different parts of Germany have been like, we'll do what we want to do.
Okay, that's right. Because, like you said, Germany, as a state that we understand it, it was like 12. It was not 12, but it was a bunch of states before, like Prussia and.
You have the Holy Roman Empire. You have all these different German princes before you
Yep.
have 1871 unification. Well, there is this misconception that the beer purity law is the first ever food safety or control law, which is actually wrong because ancient Rome actually had rules kind of like this for food safety as well as price gouging, which I thought was really cool.
I figured, when you hear about the purity law, at least for me, my first instinct is to be like, oh, well, it's to, well, because again, you name it purity, right? It's a safety thing. But, now I'm a little bit older and I'm like, well, once you said it's to help protect bakery prices or wheat prices,
Yeah.
that makes sense too. Because I had also thought if it was possibly some type of, well, you'd mentioned it. There was the third option: beers being brought in from some of the northern Germanic provinces or whatever the name is, having different additives. So then we can outlaw this beer now. We can outlaw this beer now. Okay, so it's like it's a built-in like tariff almost. It's ensuring your product.
Yeah. Well, and not even that. Well, I'll talk about it soonish when we get through, like, I don't know, the next 300 years or whatever of German beer law. But within like the past 40 years, there were brewers from Germany that got together and were like, hey, we want to get rid of this law because it's restraining. But if you know enough about beer and you look at the beer labels, you notice that really those are the only ingredients that are really in there that fall into the beer purity law. But definitely the Bavarians totally changed their law by like 40 years after they created it. Because like by the mid 1500s, they began to allow ingredients such as coriander, bay leaf, and wheat. Because you weren't supposed to have wheat in there originally.
That's right.
And then in the modern versions, once they learned about yeast, they added yeast because they're like, oh, that's allowed because it's supposed to be there.
Sure. It would like grandfathered in or something because it was always there whether they understood it or not. Interesting.
Yep. And so, as I mentioned, 1871, you have this unification of all these Germanic states, but these other brewers that haven't been under this Bavarian purity law, they definitely protested it, but Bavaria insisted on its application throughout Germany as a precondition of German unification. So these Bavarian brewers were like, oh, no, no, we are not going to unify with the rest of Germany unless you all adopt our purity law.
Interesting.
So it encountered strong resistance, of course.
Yeah.
So
That,
they
that's
did it
that seems odd to me.
right. Well, they did wind up being like, okay, you can have other ingredients. However, if you use any of those other ingredients, there's a tax on them.
Okay. Yep. Back
So,
back to money. Back to
yeah. So instead of banning those ingredients, they allowed them as long as they were being taxed, and they were mostly used by northern German brewers.
Right. I'm sure if we peeked into this a little bit more, it was probably like a little bit of north versus south,
Probably.
a little bit of us versus them kind of tribalism.
Yes, basically. And not until 1906 that the law was applied consistently across all of Germany. So they had, 40 years almost of it just not being applied consistently with this purity. And then it was not formally referred to as the really hard pronunciation word of Reinheitsgebot until the Weimar Republic, which was the Germany between World War I and World War II before Nazi Germany took over. But they've called it Reinholzgebot since then.
Hmm. So like that's when that word enters the zeitgeist, if you will.
Yes.
That's
Yeah. But, there are people that broke the law, especially like, during the 1500s, 1600s or whatever, back in, good old Bavarian times in the old country. And one of the earliest penalties was just the confiscation of beer for making it impure. So you would have lost whatever profits you may have had or any of the money you put into it. And so they wouldn't necessarily fine you back then, which I thought was a little bit nicer. But then if you put all your money
right.
into this beer that accidentally had,
Well,
wheat.
right. Well, but and then also if you've bought all the materials, right, and you're brewing beer, it's any stage in the process, that's sunk cost. Like once those materials have been steeped, you can't like re-steep. You can't, it's like trying to reuse a tea bag. Like, okay,
Yeah.
you're not going to reuse a tea bag. It reminds me of like moonshining almost.
I find it really interesting that they still have a law that basically is still upheld, and you could still just have to pay a fine if you add in other things.
Well, and I mean, at this point, you just pass that cost down. You pass that cost to me. You pass that cost to you. The brewer's not paying the fine. You pass that to us.
Yeah.
But
And it used to be they wouldn't import beer that wasn't part of the purity law or that couldn't be considered part of the purity law. And when Germany joined the EU, other countries obviously sued because they're like, why can't we? Like, that doesn't make sense. You're not allowing us to sell our beer because of your own. So then they basically changed their own laws that it's only German brewers that have to follow that or pay the price, not if you're importing, because then you just have to say you're an import beer.
technically correct. The best kind of correct.
Yeah.
That reminds me of like American whiskey, right? Where it's like Kentucky bourbon, right? Bourbon, bourbon is a legal definition.
I did not know that.
Bourbon's like a legal definition, okay? Because you could make a whiskey that's like 51% corn mash and distill it the same way that any other bourbon would be, but if you don't age it in the right barrel, or you're not using water from like Kentucky or something like that, you can't legally call it bourbon. So like bourbon is an American product in that like we made the word up and then started calling shit it, and because it's the only place you can get water from Kentucky and unused white oak barrels or whatever the other legal definition of it is, that's the only way that it exists. That's kind of what like the beer laws kind of remind me of, in that like, but it didn't start that way. It doesn't seem like it started like, it seems like it started as one thing and like now it's like tradition, right? It
Yeah.
exists to kind of like honor a tradition of something almost.
Yeah. And I would say that also goes with those Trappist breweries. It's not that the monks need to continue to make beer.
No.
But it's just cool that they do. So you can be like, that's a cool tradition to have. They've also opened a lot of Trappist breweries in like the 20th century. No, 21st century. I know my centuries.
Yeah, it's 2021, baby.
My bad. But that reminded me, we were talking about the water. There are certain beers like that have to use, they want their water to reflect the natural water around. And so they have to have like certain balance levels. And that blew my mind. Like, I've never made beer. I don't have a want to be a brewer of my own beer. I'm happy to pay somebody to make that for me. But knowing that like you need to have like this perfect conditions almost to get like this perfect stuff, and it doesn't take much to mess it up. Just, it makes me appreciate the people who watch gauges or whatever and stuff. I appreciate the brewers of the light. Like, I appreciate brewers more than I did before.
I've humored trying to get into brewing beer, but for me, it's always my concern is always the cleanliness of it, right? Because if any of your containers, any of the vessels aren't, if you don't clean it right and you got a little bit of funk left in that bottle, you know, that's going to give something else for those yeast to be chewing on while they're in there. And, it could blow the bottle, you could blow the cap right off,
Oh
all
yeah.
sorts of weird stuff. And so that's one of the main reasons why I haven't done it.
Yeah, I can't imagine coming home and having beer all over like my bathroom or my kitchen. And then like
Right.
with my luck, my cats would have been next to it when it happened. So then I would have like it would be everywhere because
Yep.
Arthur's an asshole and he's just going to run
Mhm.
around my house covered in beer. He already does that.
Yep.
Covered in other things.
Like brewing, like making the beer, because I've helped before before my wife and I moved. One of the guys in our apartment complex was brewing beer one day, and I was bored, and I went down and hung out with him and brewed beer, and it didn't take that long to do. Like, again, it's like you had a big pot on the kitchen stove with just like plant material in it, right? And it was like making a big pot of tea, but then it had to sit, and ferment, and the yeast had to do it. And so that's the part that concerns me, is having like sea monkeys living in a bottle in my closet or bathtub and hoping I didn't screw it up,
Yeah.
and that when I'm done, I'm going to be able to have beer,
Yeah.
right? And so, like you said, I'd rather get in my car, get on my bike, pedal up to the store. I don't pedal up to the store, but
Flintstone style in the car.
right, Flintstone style in the car, yeah.
But no, I can't imagine doing that. But you have ales takes quite a bit less time than a lager to make, and the majority of like American beers that are well known throughout the world, like Budweiser and stuff, are lagers, and they take a lot longer to make, which surprised me because I was like, oh, cool information I learned that doesn't translate to anything exciting except for stuff on a podcast.
Like Budweiser would not pass the purity law, because I think it uses rice or
Yes.
as one of the ingredients.
Yeah, most beers brewed in the U.S. would not pass that beer purity law for Germany, even if you
ev-
discounted like
Even if somehow,
yeah,
right, if somehow you could get your hands on German water and then bring it here, like it still
yeah,
it still won't, because of like sometimes people use like malt extracts, and that's also a thing that's popular with homebrewers too. Instead of using grains, is using extracts, because that's easier to science. It's easier to science. It's easier to beep up beep and keep that controlled versus hoping that you got the right kind of yeast that'll chew on the right kind of sugars in those malts.
yeah.
But anyways,
I like it. That's basically it. This was I'm almost done with my beer. Not, I mean, this is a podcast, so not like you can see it.
you got a German beer.
I did.
And now, listeners know I did not get a German beer. I told Courtney that I would, and I didn't, because shit, right? I don't know.
Life happens.
Life happens. So here we are. So my beer definitely would not pass the German purity law. Okay, because it is a grapefruit Kolsch.
Ooh,
Okay, but it's from my favorite brewery, the Genesee Brewery, and that uses water from the Genesee River up here in New York. I don't know if it actually does, but I'm saying it does on your podcast. Um,
they can write me an
and
angry email later if I was wrong.
yeah, yep. They can send it to insert email address for the podcast here. But the brewery is on the river, so I assume they actually do use the water, because why not? Or maybe once upon a
Yeah,
time they did, because it is a really old brewery. It is one of the oldest breweries in at least New York. I know that. Like it's like 1800 sometime in
that's old.
um, I railroaded what your beer is. What actually is your beer, out of curiosity?
You're
Am I asking you to speak German words again? And
yes.
that's the
So it's
problem?
a Weizen Doppelbock. It's a Schneider
Okay.
Weiss.
Okay.
Go with that. It's a purple
So
can.
so with the German purity laws, right? I guess this is where I'm going to be confused in public, and if it I'm just gonna be confused in public,
That's fine. We all are.
right now. Okay, all right. Yeah, I'm practicing. I'm realizing I need to be more comfortable about not knowing anything, because I don't, and I can't, right? And so you just have to keep bumping into stuff, apparently. But anyways, Belgian, like the type of beer, Belgian, right? Now, is this again me just being an idiot and falsely assuming that a Belgian beer would follow German purity laws? Is that what's happening right now?
Yes, because
Probably.
so however, okay, here to like less confuse you, like when you think of like an English ale, it's going to use the yeast that has been associated with those English beers for hundreds of years, for centuries. And Belgian beers have like usually their own type of yeast that they're using, because you can use different types of yeast to make those flavors that have that hint where you're like, oh, this is definitely an English, summer ale or whatever.
Mm, mm,
Um, I'm like the worst type of beer drinker, because I'm like, I'll drink anything. When somebody asks what I want, I'm like,
mm-hmm,
whatever you have extra of, I'll take it.
mm-hmm,
So I'm,
mm-hmm. Is it right? Is it cold? Is it wet? But
yeah,
that's
I'm trying to be better about that on a personal level, even though I know I'm not. But knowing that, like when you have those different types of classifications, a lot of it to be classified as that depends on like the water that's being used as well as that yeast.
right.
Like a lot of the other stuff that comes with like the taste, like, oh, it tastes like a springtime morning.
Sure.
Like that's all subjective. Like that doesn't taste like a springtime morning to me. That tastes like, oh shit, I'm late to school. Like, I don't know, like in college when you're like, I'm hungover, my mouth tastes like bad beer. I gotta go take a test. So that's what that tastes like to me. So that's like all subjective.
Well, because like for the longest time, this is like the story of my life now, because I've admitted twice on this podcast I was just confidently wrong about things before. And so this may just be another one of those times where I'm finding out right now that I've just been confidently wrong about something, because I would get Belgian beers, right? Because like I said, once upon a time I was a beer snob. Now know I know why I was doing it. It was to so then I could be like, hey, I know a bunch of stuff, right?
Yeah,
And
we all are
now
though.
now I'm exhausted. But anytime I would get a Belgian beer, I didn't like the mouthfeel of it, because I felt like you kind of got like this like velvet mouthfeel at the end. All I could think of is like cough medicine as a kid, but that's too harsh of an analogy for what I'm actually talking about. But
Yeah.
the like Belgian beers would leave this mouthfeel for me that I never enjoyed afterwards. And so again, I falsely assumed that they were under this purity law that you were talking about. So I was like, again, just with the advent of the internet and smartphones, I feel like whenever you admit to not knowing something, you're just admitting that you're too lazy to look it up now.
No, because it means that by admitting that you're wrong means that either A, you've researched or someone has told you and you accepted it, versus just being like, no, it's what I've thought for like 20 something years. It's what I'm going to go with for the rest of my life. But yeah, if you have a smartphone next to you 95% of the time, right? Like we all do. So
Yeah. Yeah, so what I'm saying is, like, I know I'm wrong, but I also know that I'm okay with being willfully ignorant now.
but also like there are just so many beers. There's quite a few beer apps that you can download that when you type in the name of a beer, it'll tell you like the style it's supposed to be, what the ingredients are, the taste that it
Mm,
officially gets
mm.
when it's taste tested by somebody who's certified and whatever is being a judge, which I didn't know that was a thing. And I kind of like, that's cool. I just want to judge things and people, so I just keep getting like judge certifications and things, and beer would be fun. because it's subjective. So, but I also like, I can't smell things. Like my smelliness is,
Hmm.
but sour beers are my favorite beers.
Jess, she really likes those too. And
They're,
so,
because they're not really like they're beer, but they're not beer.
yeah, well, because they're not as carbonated, if I recall, right? Or at least they don't feel. Again, it's a feel, it's a mouth feel thing for me, and sours is another one of those beers that has a mouth feel that I don't
Yeah. So she just
that
wanted
I
to
don't.
share with you. That's a great
Well,
reason.
yeah, yeah. There's a brewery near us. Again, would not pass the German purity law, but they still make very good beer. But they do a lot of sours. They've been doing a lot of sours, but they'll do like dessert. It'll be like a dessert sour, so it's like a cherry pie sour, or
Yeah.
like I have a I think I have like a pina colada sour in the mini fridge, which again that would not pass the German purity law. For me, beer's an opportunity to like see what's possible, right? It's like this little like safe space to like see what's possible
Yeah.
in in a way, because you can go to some place. Again, I can recall going to what the fuck are they called? A bar. Jesus
It's
Christ.
been a long time, Tyler.
I can recall going to a bar, and the brewery was Elysium, was the name of the brewery. I can't recall what the name of the beer was, but it was a Belgian beer with peppercorns in it.
Okay.
Yep. Again,
Yeah,
you
we can
know,
add that in.
right? That was the beer that some Belgian beer with peppercorns. It was a farmhouse style Belgian beer with peppercorns, and I just went. And at the time I'd never seen anything like that before, so I was just like, I gotta try it, and it was fun, and I was there with my buddies, and so we were all like, I can't believe I'm drinking this peppercorn beer, right? And so to me, that's you know, that's the thing with beer. Whereas, now I don't drink as much beer because, it'll be just me, and that's not as.
Fun.
I mean, it can be, but it usually isn't.
Yeah, I mean, this just makes me want to go and visit the breweries near you because they're definitely different than the breweries that we have
Hmm.
here,
Hmm.
which because of like even just going to a different city in the same state, whether, suburban to an urban city, the breweries are going to be different and how they brew beer is going to be different too. And the things that they want to do, even who the owner is. So if you have somebody who's from like the West Coast versus somebody from the East Coast or Central US, their flavors and what they want to brew are going to be completely different. Also, fun fact about sour beer, because I looked up my notes because I'm a huge nerd. So, sour beer is actually from the bacteria from like yogurt and stuff, as opposed to yeast.
Huh. Presumably, like the process of this microorganism feasting on sugars and excreting alcohols, uh, is the
Yep,
same.
it's
Interesting.
it's a different process, but it comes with like I would say the same result, except for sour beers taste nothing like the other beers.
Mm-mm. Like, again, I don't think they're not as effervescent. If
That's
that's.
a SAT word if I ever heard one.
Yep. Yeah, it's not as effervescent as a I don't know, like an American Pilsner, or something like that, right? You get the big foamy head and the bubbles, right? Whereas with a sour, I don't feel like you get that. I don't feel like you get that. And again, I assume it has to be because of the yeast, because that's where you can also. I know like homebrewers also have like carbonation tablets as well, to up to like you can like up the
Maybe.
carbonation, and so I wonder if that's what I'm reacting to as well with the beers that I'm with, like, more mainstream, I guess, mainstream mass produced type beers. I wonder if they do any type of, like, you know liquid carbonation or something, versus having all their
Oh,
carbonation be
I mean, they could. Honestly, this is about
natural.
where my expertise, that's not very expert, stops with the brewing
Yeah,
process.
right. Well, yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm asking the questions that I could have looked up before being here,
Nah,
but I didn't know I was going to have the question until we arrived
and that's
here.
okay. I admit that I'm not an expert at this, but I just find I'm just fascinated by the history of like that whole brewing. It's a hard, I got issues saying words, but I'm fascinated by the history of brewing beer and how it's tied into religion. Because when you think of religion, you don't necessarily think of alcohol, but the fact that you had monks who would happily supply. I mean, maybe you had to definitely say that you were Christian and you believed in Jesus for the monks to give you the beer. Who knows? Maybe they were all different. Well, I think that's going to wrap up the time that we have left for today. Hopefully, you enjoyed your time hanging out with me and to Tyler.
I had fun, and I hope this worked for you.
Yes. And with that, I'm Courtney. Thank you again for joining us for But Have You Heard About? And I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day, evening, whatever it may be. Have a good one. Bye.